when we let go of striving, that's when we soften enough and surrender to, I could say, our naked experience, to ordinary self, to recognize, to see clearly the extraordinary nature of ordinary self, to know our wholeness. Now, from wholeness, we're not going to go to the other side of duality and then become couch potatoes who don't create or produce anything. Exactly the opposite. We're then free of the fixation with self, and there is that much more space within us to be used as a vessel for life, for all kinds of creation to come through us.
Hello and welcome to Nourish. My name is Kasha and I'm an entrepreneur, longtime meditator, and student of Chinese medicine. On this podcast, I share the stories and tools from Type A high achievers who have discovered that elusive state of balance between success and inner connection, purpose, and awareness. Think yin and yang in flow. Because hustling without balance just leads to burnout. My hope is that this podcast offers you inspiration and tools to help you cultivate your best life. Now let's jump into it. Hello, my friends. Welcome back to the Nourish podcast. I'm your host, Kasha, and I am on cloud 11. After the most incredible conversation with my next guest, Deborah Eden Tull. Eden is the founder of Mindful Living Revolution. She is a teacher. She is a best-selling author of 3 books, including Luminous Darkness, an Engaged Buddhist Approach to Embracing the Unknown, which was just released in September. She's a spiritual activist, deep ecologist, and sustainability educator. She spent 7 years training as a Buddhist monk, and her teachings emphasizes the personal, interpersonal, transpersonal, societal, ecological, mystical, and global impacts of awareness practice. She facilitates many beautiful workshops, all of which I'm going to deep link below. She teaches online and at retreat centers like Esalen. She also facilitates the Work That Reconnects, as created by Buddhist scholar and eco-philosopher Joanna Macy, for transforming our pain and our love for our world into compassionate action. And she teaches with UCLA's Mindful Awareness Research Center. Whew. Y'all, this conversation truly just awakened something within me. We started off with the theme of exploring resolutions versus intentions for the new year, but it's just turned into this beautiful conversation all about balancing the energies within us, the energies of yin and yang, especially for us Type A mindful folks. How do you balance striving with interconnection and inner awareness? And how do you recognize what is authentically true to you versus something that stems from a need to fix something within us? Eden definitely dives into debunking some of the principles around personal development and how to reframe that for ourselves. We also dive into the process of creation as opposed to the product, and why that reframe can be so powerful for shifting us into a place of authenticity and finding that state of flow. There is so much in this conversation that just completely broke my heart open and shifted my perspective, and I am so honored to share it with all of you. This is a perfect conversation, especially as we start to enter into the new year. And without further ado, let's welcome Eden to the Nourish podcast.
Hello, I'm really excited to be here with you and curious to where our conversation will take us.
Likewise, I was truly giddy this morning knowing that you were going to be joining me today. Your bio is so fascinating, which we are absolutely going to dive into. But before we get into all of that, I would love to start with the question that I ask every single guest. And that is, what are 3 words that you would use to describe yourself?
I will answer that in the moment. What's arising is multidimensional, interconnected, which is the ground for my whole life and being and work, and interconnected, which points to a quality of living from a deep listening, which really comes from recognizing meditation as a way of life, not just something we do on the cushion. Yeah.
Wow. So I wasn't planning to ask this, but those words are just so juicy. I think I have to. I'm curious to know from your point of view, what is the difference between being interconnected and interconnected? Because I know a core theme of a lot of the work that you do and some of your retreats I've noticed really talk about the interconnection between us and nature and, ourselves and nature. So I would love to hear kind of your differentiation there.
Sure. Well, I think it's important to recognize that as we deepen a practice, we live both in a greater state of inner awareness. And what I mean by that is we simply have to on the path of knowing ourselves, of befriending the many different aspects of the self, of working with our survival strategies, of making wise choices in life. Learn how to listen within. And I talk about this as interconnection, the difference between maybe how I experienced life before coming to practice and felt actually a bit fractured inside and didn't truly trust my intuition and ability to access my own center of wisdom. At the same time, we deepen our capacity, the pathway for non-local awareness or field consciousness, the consciousness which holds everything, our capacity to, we might again use the phrase, deeply listen to the more than human world, deeply listen to trees that we engage with, deeply listen and receive what we might feel like is guidance from beyond. So ultimately, it's not necessary to have those discernments of inner and interconnection, but I find it really useful on the path because someone might notice, oh, I'm in a place in my life where I really could benefit from deepening interconnection. Or, I don't think I'm spending much time just resting in field consciousness. You with me?
100%. I mean, it almost makes me think of, and I think it's just so beautifully described because, I'm a student of Chinese medicine, and there's this term, which a lot of our listeners are familiar with at this point, because we talk about it on here a lot, but the kind of principles of yin and yang, and how, although they are opposing forces, they're also connected, where there is an element of one within the other. So there is this aspect of differentiation, but also connection and how they kind of flow into each other. So I think that was just such a beautiful explanation using very different words of something of a very similar concept.
Yes. And I might just riff on that for a minute. In my book, Luminous Darkness, which I know we'll get into, I'm inviting people to look at the very limited collective associations we hold with darkness, placing light on a pedestal over darkness. And we could be talking about darkness within ourselves or human consciousness or difficult emotions. We could be talking about darkness as the yin, restorative aspect of nature, which is great medicine. And the more we instead question our assumptions and become curious about darkness, it opens us up to a much greater embodiment of the full spectrum and interplay of light and dark. And in the book, I share from what you just shared, the symbol of the ancient Tao, the yin and yang, where there's a dot of light in the dark and a dot of dark in the light. And so I think we'll have some fun through our different orientations pointing to the same thing. Yeah?
Absolutely. Ooh, and I want to dive into all of that, but I want to start by grounding our audience with your absolutely beautiful story, because you have such a remarkable bio. I mean, you're the founder of Mindful Living Revolution, which we'll dive into. You're a teacher, an author, spiritual activist, deep ecologist, and sustainability educator. But you spent 7 years training as a Buddhist monk. So I would love to hear a bit of that story.
Sure. Yeah. So I grew up in Los Angeles, and I talk in my book about how even though I grew up in a very unconventional family of artists and activists and really free thinkers, my parents were hippies, the culture that surrounded us was one that I point to as a culture of sun shining, trying to keep it light, stay positive. Let's focus on recreation, even when there are other things to address. Let's keep it surface or avoid more complex conversations and that kind of thing. And it just never, ever, ever sat with me right. It always felt like, okay, so some of my emotions and the more sensitive part of me is just going to kind of need to get pushed aside or left out to survive this kind of world. And then when I was 11 and lost my dad really unexpectedly to cancer, and I talk about my dad as my first spiritual teacher. He was a contemplative Christian who was an extraordinary model for me in the years I spent with him. Then it became even clear, oh gosh, well, then when you're navigating grief, in this culture of sunshining, it's really unwelcome. And all I knew to do back then was kind of repress it, kind of describe myself as kind of putting a smile on 24/7 because it seemed like that's what people wanted. And I experienced more loss over coming years, but then simultaneously, even though we lived in what I'm describing as that culture of sunshining, my parents were activists, and my mom founded what became 4 different nonprofits that began in LA's Skid Row. And so I spent a lot of my childhood kind of walking between these 2 different worlds of the world of social justice and activists and change agents and service, the beautiful, extraordinary spirit of service and what it's like when communities willing to roll up their sleeves and get engaged. But then also the world that was saying, oh, what's important is getting somewhere and maybe success, and here's how it looks, and fitting in and things like that. So it was a little confusing to me. I was always asking deep questions. So when I was at the end of high school and it was time to embark on my own journey, I left LA and went to a very liberal college where I got to design my own major. And it was called Ecology, Community, and Social Change, Design for a Sustainable Future. I got dedicated to daily meditation at about 18, 19, at the same time as I learned to grow all my own food and was studying organic gardening and permaculture. We had gardened growing up, but not to this extent. And I just became very, very dedicated to what I would call now sort of a return to source, like this culture of sunshining and distraction and also overconsumption never spoke to me. And at the same time, I had a lot of emotions and still grief that I hadn't resolved within myself. So after a number of years of kind of doing my own activist work and living in earth-based communities, so living off the grid, at 26, I chose to become a Zen Buddhist monk and took that leap of faith. It definitely was. It took some courage, and I didn't know how long I would be there. But as life had, I was there for 7.5 years. And that was an extraordinary, extraordinary training and growth time in my life. And as anyone who's on the path knows, it just keeps going from that point. And when I left, my practice became deeper in ways that it actually couldn't when I was a monastic. And there's a lot I could say about the in-between, but I've written a few books in that time. I've been a teacher and mentor for many years. I'm still someone who makes my priority connection to source, both through daily meditation as a way of life, this deep listening as a way of life, but also partnership with nature and kind of a way of being in which we are really working in collaboration with life. So, Mindful Living Revolution is the name of the nonprofit that I started some years ago, which bridges our practice, our personal awakening, and collective awakening, how we engage in this world of so much need, this world in a time of so much change, so much uncertainty. And so it's exciting. There's a really extraordinary community of people globally. And I think the last thing I'll say is that I simply feel blessed at a time when there's so much harsh and bad world news to take in, to witness and get to experience the courage and willingness and open-heartedness of so many people every single day. So that the stories, of course, that the news shares and the courage of human consciousness don't exactly match up, right? So I think I'll stop there.
Mm. Oh my gosh. Where do I start from that? I mean, I find your story to be so fascinating, and I'm so excited to dig into so many aspects of it, because it's just so interesting as you describe your journey of going from, this notion of like bright sunshine to really the opposite side of the spectrum in terms of this, journey of real inner exploration in a way, right? That's kind of what I imagine a bit of the monastic life to look like.
Yes.
And I'm so curious, what was it like, I guess, transitioning between the two, and then now transitioning back and balancing the two? That's a core theme of what we talk about on this podcast, right? Is, for the longest time, at least from my personal experience and in talking to a lot of our listeners, there's this belief that, you're either or, right? Like you either are, living in the sunshine world, writing positive affirmations and being in a type A achiever, or you are really connected and living, let's say, like a monastic life. And so what was it like, swinging between the two and then finding that balance? Like, is it even possible to flow between the two states, or is it really a requirement to kind of go one way or the other?
Thank you. No, it's not a requirement to go one way or the other. And isn't it such classic conditioning to put things in that either or, right? We're so trained to put things in the frame of duality. And I would say that today, one of the things I practice and teach is just the inquiry of how to live in the world without being of the world. And so in Buddhism, we talk about having one foot in the absolute, the place of absolute truth, and the place we access by dropping into presence, and at the same time having a foot in the relative world, right? And I think it's becomes a really beautiful dance to remember the absolute and come from what I call in my weekly meditation group the already awakened state. This group is called Remembering, so that it's not about cultivating a whole thing that's not already inside of us or striving to get to the enlightened state, but remembering, folks, awareness is already awake. We just need to remember it. It never leaves us, but we leave it. So from that place, which is a place of, which I mentioned earlier, both interconnection and interconnection, it totally changes how we engage in the beautiful, messy, sticky human world. We engage with more compassion and clear seeing. We engage causing less harm. We engage being willing to be used as alchemical vessels for healing in different situations. We engage with more willingness and acceptance. It's just the two work together in healing relationship. Does that make sense?
So I'm hearing and I can relate to the aspect of how the practice, bringing it into your daily life, can shift some of your actions and how you view
it has to
the world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But I want to dig into this a bit, and I'm so excited I have to stop saying excited. Like, I genuinely am excited. I obviously skew in one side of the spectrum, if it isn't obvious by now. But I'm so curious to know, you are a business owner, right? You just came back from a retreat, yet you describe yourself as, and I can feel it through your energy and your voice, as a deeply interconnected and interconnected human as well. How do you balance that practically? And I think that's hearing maybe your example from more of a tangible point of view is going to be really inspiring, and I think a learning opportunity for myself and for our listeners, because it can be a struggle. And I'm sure you speak with a lot of folks out there who, are jumping from a Zoom call to a Zoom call or a podcast episode and then teaching a class and, navigating just running a business even, right? Like the practicalities of that outer world that we live in. How do you bring that sense of connection and presence throughout your day when you're not meditating? Like, what does that look like for you, or what has been supportive for you, if you can speak to that?
Sure. Well, first, to be transparent, when you said you are a business owner, I went inside, am I a business owner? Because it's just not a way I think of myself. Yet I run a global nonprofit.
You are, though.
Oh, I am.
You're an author. You're a teacher. Come on. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right
and
there.
Here's what's great is the first thing that I want to say is this. I shared that, long ago I learned to take on a daily meditation practice as the same time that I learned to organic farm. And I noticed this real connection point. And the connection was, well, actually, I could write a whole book about the connection, but what I'll say now is, it was that it totally showed me that the dominant paradigm has a fixation on product over process. And the entire point for me of being alive, and remember, I got the reminder at a young age that our time here is short. People we love could die at any time that we could. That the importance is process. And so just to get a little more detailed about that, conventional farming is focused on product. And so in order to get the biggest, the fastest harvest, the most, we will do anything, and we'll justify causing harm to the soil, using toxic chemicals, wasting water, et cetera, et cetera. Organic farming, at least based in its integrity and its original form, that movement is committed to process. And the process is growing healthy soil. It's not even growing plants. It's growing healthy soil, cultivating healthy soil, which is, again, I'll say, a living process, an ongoing process, and which points to the question, what harm will I justify to get to product? But how can I nourish and care for this soil right now through listening and paying attention to it, what's needed, and then trusting that the healthiest product grows naturally from good soil. You following me so far?
Oh, absolutely.
So this became an orientation for life. It's an orientation for spiritual practice. We don't practice to try to get to or attain enlightenment, or if we do, we're not going to get that far. We're going to see, oh, my ego had this misconception, which is part of the conditioning of marketplace mentality, which has been passed down to all of us through individualism, capitalism, and even colonialism, patriarchy, and a disconnect from nature that started ages ago. So when we have this focus on process, we get to understand, number one, meditation isn't just something I do on the cushion. Maybe that's the formal aspect of my practice, but it's a way of life. It's something we're engaging in, a way of being in every moment, whether we're grocery shopping or on a date or checking emails or business owners doing the accounting. So when we're focused on everything being our working meditation, we might say, which is a big part of Zen practice, there's not this separation. It's not like, for instance, it's not about just getting shit done. It's about being awake and present in my body as I get my responsibilities done with care. It's about noticing what conditioning arises that causes stress or projection or self-doubt that arises that then requires compassion. So I'm meditating while working. There's a lot more I could say, but I'll stop there. Does that make sense so far?
Oh my gosh. That, first of all, I feel like I'm going through a live epiphany, and I wish we had the video on so you could see my face. It's just, I mean, it is so well timed. Even the phrase product versus process. And there's a podcast episode that we actually have live now where I spoke with a gentleman who is pioneering a new form of kind of creative expression and exploration in the form of process painting. And we talk about that very act of cultivating creativity, or I guess re-remembering your innate creativity through the process of painting as opposed to focusing on the product. And I just love how you tied it back to really re-exploring how we are setting our intentions in a way, right? Where it's not just about the end goal. It's about how do you want to get there, and allowing that to be, if I'm hearing you correctly, how you structure your days and actually your life, right?
Yes, yes. So there's both a discipline to it and just an organic flow to it. But a couple things I would add. Yeah, we might not even get to the product because we don't know. I'm going to emphasize our time here is short, even if we live to be 100 years old. So we need to focus on the process of being here when our attention and awareness are fully in the moment. There's joy, there's more space around everything we do. There's an ability to rest in the bigger picture, even while navigating. Like this morning, I had to navigate kind of a complex logistic for a teaching trip coming up, and it was a bit of a headache, but I navigated it from presence and self-compassion, and it wasn't that big of a headache, and then passed through. So there's so much. I mean, this could be a topic of a whole podcast conversation itself, just around what does the notion of working meditation mean, for instance. And another aspect of what it means is that we're using everything that arises as we let ourselves be vessels for incredible creations. We let what we're doing be a mirror for self-awareness. So we get to see in the process of when over effort and striving comes up, instead of being in the flow, which is a really enjoyable place to work from, and then get to notice, well, why is that coming up? Okay, here's the limiting belief. Let's let it go. I'm getting kind of tired of that. Yeah. So I'll stop there.
Beautifully said. And I really appreciate you sharing this perspective, because I think it will be, this podcast skews towards a lot of mindful type A's, let's say. And I really think there's something to be said to really looking at how are you cultivating the process to get to wherever it is you want to go, as opposed to focusing solely on the product.
May I add one more thing?
Yeah, absolutely. Please.
I think I'll just use the example of, for instance, writing this third book. When I set the goal to write it, it wasn't just to finish a book I love that's an offering to the world about luminous darkness, but my intention equally included, and for the process to be one of peace, of self-care, because a lot of work and heavy lifting goes into writing a book, a process of co-creation, which means kind of getting out of the way, and which I experience more of myself being used as a channel for writing than I'm doing the writing. So that was built into my intention. And that was really important, because otherwise, sure, I would have this, I think, really powerful book at the end. And yet that would have been a lot of time spent just working hard or perhaps struggling. So it's important to be clear in our intentions. And there are also, for type A mindfulness folks out there, disciplines we can bring in to help us. Like, for instance, though I've written 3 books, I don't enjoy very much being on a computer screen. So I have a practice of, number one, I take really generous time every morning, as does my husband, for our practice, for meditation, for body practice, for simply connecting with the more than human world before I turn on any devices. Every device I have gets turned off at 6 p.m. unless I have to teach that night. Another piece is I'll set a timer when, for instance, typing, of like every 20 minutes, so I can pause and make sure I'm not leaving my body. And actually, I'm a dancer, so I'll take 3 minutes to dance. I'm dancing and typing. That's how I do admin. So these are little tricks for how to balance maybe what you're talking about, business owner and flow. So go on.
I love that. Now, we'll definitely, and I promise we're going to get to the book, but I have to throw in one more question here because, as I mentioned, we have type A mindfulness folks tuning in for sure. What is your personal perspective on balancing or navigating that sense of ambition, right? Because I think that there is, in many ways, and maybe it's a reframe that is needed here, but from the perspective of inner knowing and also, I guess, balancing striving with acceptance, where does navigating ambition come into play? And maybe I can even reframe that, right? Where you are a published author with these beautiful books. How did you balance, the desire to have your book, let's say, be a bestseller with creating it, with publishing it? Like, how do you navigate that from an emotional and maybe even spiritual point of view?
So let me pause for a moment and look within. There's a couple things I want to offer in response to your question. First, I just don't believe in striving. When I hear that word, I notice my body kind of contracts. It gets a little tense. Here's what striving kind of means to me. It means that somehow we're coming from the perspective of self-improvement and from the orientation of self-improvement. And I consider self-improvement to be a myth, to be ultimately unhelpful. And let me unpack that, because some listeners are not going to like that statement.
Yes.
So
Please
here we go. A lot of people, probably most of us, first come to meditation or mindfulness as a pursuit of self-improvement. This will help me get to where I want to be, or there must be something wrong with me, even as a subconscious assumption, but this will help fix me, or, I've got all these aspects of me I'm just not right with. I need to meditate and meet all the mindfulness standards, and then I'll get there. You with me so far?
Oh, yes. You are talking to, you have your target audience literally on the line with you right now.
Well, I lead a New Year's retreat and an online process every single year called Awaken the New Year, and a process for setting conscious intentions, where we really unpack and help to dissolve this myth of self-improvement. Because if we continue on our mindfulness path, we get to see some of the mechanism behind this, that, number one, ultimately this keeps me kind of fixated on the self, not the larger self, but small self. It keeps me fixated or maintains a story that as I am, I'm not whole, and I need to keep working or running the treadmill, even now using spiritual paraphernalia and language to get there. It maintains the small self or ego standing outside of life, looking in, assessing, judging, measuring, and comparing everything. You following?
Oh, yeah.
And we begin to see, maybe there's more to this than this pursuit of self-improvement. We begin to soften and allow our sense of self to even dissolve. So, oh, maybe I don't have to be judging and assessing this being and taking their strengths or perceived failures so personally. And maybe there's a bigger invitation here. And that invitation is freedom, folks. That invitation is about remembering that when we let go of striving, and I can share a personal story about this if you want to, but I'll just keep going for a minute. When we let go of striving, that's when we soften enough and surrender to, I could say, our naked experience, to ordinary self, to recognize, to see clearly the extraordinary nature of ordinary self, to know our wholeness. Now, from wholeness, we're not going to go to the other side of duality and then become couch potatoes who don't create or produce anything. Exactly the opposite. We're then free of the fixation with self, and there is that much more space within us to be used as a vessel for life, for all kinds of creation to come through us. Endless creation to come through us, but none of it is about the self. Does that make sense to you?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I have to admit that I'm getting moments where I'm like, okay, I can start to, because I'm speaking from my experience right now as I imagine relating to this, and I try to embody what I know a lot of the audience must be feeling. And there are these twinges that I think come to fruition, that to have that shift in perspective just by starting to focus on less so the product and more so the process, right? Because there's an aspect of letting go of the outcome, maybe having that vision and having that be the direction you're going in. But you have to surrender to some degree failure, the outcome of success or the outcome of failure to even pursue the creation of something that's unknown, right? So that just happens, I think, organically when you build up the courage. Maybe not for everybody, because there are definitely people out there who I think are so attached to the product that the process really turns into something that's almost detrimental, if even on a personal level. So I think that happens naturally. But when it comes to really embodying that, I think there's still, for a lot of people, perhaps a struggle of, how do I balance having this vision that I want to bring into the world? And, where does it become striving versus natural? Like, how do you know that you're coming from that wholesome place? Does it feel different?
It feels entirely different. It feels entirely different. There is, at least for me, no joy when I'm just focused on product, because again, there's room to justify using the body as a tool rather than a being of wisdom. There's room to justify disobeying our natural feedback system, dishonoring ourselves, all of that. There's just too much room. So there's no real joy. There's so much joy in the co-creative process, but notice I'm using the word co-creative instead of creative. When we sometimes set down, and I come from a family of artists, so I know the process of painting or sitting down to draw something, and that point at which the ego can start coming in and be like, oh, what do I think about this? And how's the finish? And it starts distracting from the flow, right? But co-creative for me is more honest, because it means recognizing that it's not that I'm doing this, it's that I'm through presence, through mindful awareness, I am willing to co-create with life. And so I want to make sure it's not sounding too philosophical rather than accessible or practical, but to consider one of the ways I talk about it in, for instance, the New Year's intentions work, which is very much about releasing limiting beliefs. And yes, once and for all. And setting intention from a freer place rather than the place of self-improvement, like the place we do resolutions from. For me, there's a point in practice in which we really do awaken to interconnection, as we mentioned before, as our foundation, as who and what we are. And it's incredibly freeing. And from that place, there's a sense of, oh my gosh, this is bigger than me and my little bubble. I'm not practicing for self-improvement. I'm practicing for all of my ancestors. I'm living into greater joy for the entire collective. I'm meeting my shadows for human consciousness. It just becomes bigger. And we end up feeling that we're both being cheered on by, we have the support of all of our ancestors, of the collective, and that we're accessing our willingness, our courage for the collective. So in other words, it becomes about we, not me. And when anything becomes about we, like that, we consciousness, we have a ton more energy than we once did. And I want to emphasize for listeners, I'm not saying this to discount the individual, or both an individual and a part of the whole. But in a society that's had far too much conditioning asserting the individual, we've gotten really confused, and most people don't even know what it means to live and then co-create from we consciousness. It's way more freeing.
Beautifully said. And it really makes me think about just the impact of the individualistic focus. I mean, there is something that is obviously empowering about that, but it does lead to disconnection, the way that it's started to create in our society, or the way it is established in our society. And so it's no wonder that some of the statistics on loneliness are out there, and the impact of really just focusing so much on the individual striving, achievement, position, lifestyle, family unit. It really causes, I believe at least, and I think research supports on like lower level, some of the impact of that there's a negative effects, truly.
Yes. And just something I write about in the book is this. We as human beings, no matter what walk of life, we are always navigating the mystery, the unknown. Luminous Darkness is very much about learning how to meet the unknown with a humble and open heart, with reverence and curiosity rather than fear, as a teacher. And what happens is we've been conditioned to, through our discomfort of the unknown, which is also being uncomfortable with the field of all possibility, we try to find security by turning to externals and building scaffolding, could be a metaphor I would use. So we try to build the scaffolding that's going to keep us safe and secure. The right job, the right partner, the right amount of income, perhaps, the right identity, the right this or that. That's all external based. Not any of that, not any of it actually points to genuine security, the security that comes spiritually through resting in being. And I would just offer that earlier in this call, we talked about sort of monasticism versus being out in the world. We can live out in the world and still have an internal rather than external focus be our foundation. That an inward focus doesn't mean I'm cutting myself off from life or numbing out or becoming self-fixated. It just means when we turn within, we give ourselves a chance to ground and anchor at center, to actually live from center, to notice what pulls us off center. This is part of what I mean when I say inner connection. From center is also where we experience greater interconnection. And engaging with life from our center is, again, I'm going to say the greatest joy, but also a place that's such a contribution, just how we show up to the world. And it's not a static place center. It's not a place where you're always meeting the perfect standard of mindfulness. It just means you're anchored in being, in we consciousness, in the here and now, instead of in story. So yeah.
Eden, I truly, I think this conversation, I feel like I had a breakthrough as we were speaking, quite frankly.
I'm so
And
glad.
I'm just floored. And I could honestly keep speaking with you for hours, and I have all these additional questions that I wrote out. And I think we covered like 1/8 of the outline, which I knew was going to happen. But honestly, I feel like this was such a beautiful introduction to your philosophy, and even starting, we really approached this from the point of view of kind of exploring the experience of balancing both sides of ourselves. And I think really introduced well the concept of how the unknown and how some of that darkness is actually part of our lived experience and shouldn't be so feared. And so I just really appreciate this beautiful framing.
Yes. And just to add, the more we are willing to be curious rather than fear the darkness, the more we're open to the field of possibility. And what happens when people are striving, which we talked about earlier, I have this goal, here's how it's got to look, I've got to get there. We actually are trying to control life or control the co-creative process, for instance, instead of learning to rest, set our intention from our heart, and then learning to rest in the darkness, the field of fertile possibility from which all creativity arises. There has to be a softening into that not knowing for us to be used for our own potential. And I would add, for our potential on behalf of the collective. So, yeah, even though we maybe veered off some of our initial questions, we've gotten to model being in process together. And I would really encourage people listening who feel called, and you are most invited, Cassia, to come to the Conscious Intentions workshop in one of its forms this year. The first one is online, 2 days, mid-December. There's a retreat in January at Esalen, a workshop through UCLA's Mindfulness Center. So there's lots of choices. Yeah.
Oh, yes. And that actually brings me to my next question. Where can people find you, and what are, in addition to this workshop, which by the way, I will so be there, so plan to see me, where can people find you, and what do you have coming up? I know you have this beautiful book that was just published for those of us who really want to explore the Engaged Buddhist Approach to Embracing the Unknown. It is Luminous Darkness. But what else do you have coming up? Is there anything that you really want to share with our audience?
Sure. So you can find me at my website, my full name, DeborahEdenTull.com. And I'm on Facebook from time to time. And Mindful Living Revolution you can find on Instagram. And there's so many offerings. There's a weekly meditation group online called Remembering the Already Awakened State, and I guide a Sangha called the Fierce Compassion Sangha. There might be a waiting list now, but New Year's retreat, I teach every year, Awaken the New Year, setting conscious intentions for our lives and our world, and this is at Esalen. And there are other in-person retreats. There's also a really special program dear to my heart that begins in February called The Heart of Listening. And it's an incredible journey to deepening embodiment of practice. It's open to everyone who's been practicing for long enough to have a little meditation under your belt, but it's also appropriate for people who are in positions of leadership, facilitation, of any kind, because the more we learn to live from center, from shared presence, the more we become naturally leaders in a time of change, and there are ways to do so consciously versus unconsciously. So people can find out everything they need to on my website. And I also have a monthly women's gathering that involves meditation and dance. That's fabulous. So I've really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you so much, Kasia.
It was such an honor. I will link everything in the show notes. And thank you so much, Eden, for joining me today. This was such a beautiful conversation. Oh my gosh.
Thank you again.
Thanks everyone for tuning in. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Nourish. If you enjoyed this conversation, please consider leaving a review or sharing it with a friend. Reviews really help this podcast grow and reach a larger audience, and I'm so grateful for that. I publish new episodes twice a month, so hit the subscribe button to be notified. See you next time.